Hello everyone! Today I have the making of video to share with you, and this is actually the first video in a series about making an 1890s cycling costume. Today I'll be focusing on making the jacket. This jacket will eventually have a slim waist, flared skirt, and very full leg of mutton sleeves. But in this video we'll only be going through the beginning stages, which involve designing, draping, some assembly, and working on the collar. If any of that interests you, then you should keep on watching, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. My primary fabric for this project is a 13-ounce wool herringbone. I'm using 2 yards of it, and it's from a site called organiccottonplus.com. I was sent this fabric for review purposes, and I think it's really beautiful, and I really enjoyed working with it for this project. I'll be talking about it more on my blog, but I thought you guys would prefer to see this material in action, so that's what I'll be doing in this video. In addition to the wool, I'll be using Lamode buttons in the style 219, and a few yards of a lightweight quilter's cotton for lining. The first step in the jacket making process was coming up with the design. I had a rough idea in my head, but I wanted actual historical references to base it off of. So I looked through a magazine from the 1890s and a book called The Keystone Jacket and Dress Cutter in search for references. Then I started sketching. I combined elements that I found while browsing into one design that I really liked. It has the collar and sleeves from one example I found and the length and closure method from another. I also decided on some intricate back seaming to add a bit of flair to a simple design. And I mean that quite literally. This jacket is going to have an impressive flared skirt to it. Using my sketch as a reference, I began draping the pattern. I do this by tightly pinning pieces of cotton over my dress form, then pulling and pinning them in place so the fabric sits snugly against the form. I draw in the seam lines I want, then trim away excess fabric. I always start from the front and move towards the back of the garment. And as I do this, I also mark out the waistline and where I want the armholes to be. If I accidentally trim off too much material, then I'll write a note on the fabric and alter it when transferring it to paper. I should also mention that I fully realize this isn't the normal or professional way to draft a fitted jacket pattern, but I'm a very visual person, and seeing the pattern come together on a three-dimensional form is a lot easier for me. This is the finished draped pattern. Now it's time to turn that into a paper pattern, which is far more functional. To do that, I'm placing the fabric over top of paper, then tracing around it. It's during this stage that I'll make changes, like lowering the waistline or making the hem longer. I'll also make the bust a bit smaller and trim it in at the waistline, since my body has a different shape than my dress form, especially when I'm wearing 1890s foundation garments. After the tracing and alterations are done, I add seam allowances to every edge. I'm going to be working with 1/2-inch seam allowances, but if you're worried about the fit, then leaving more is a good idea. I should also mention that I did not draft the sleeve pattern for this. I'm using one from the book 59 Authentic Victorian Patterns, which is a really fantastic resource for that sort of thing. Now all the pieces get pinned to the wool. You want all the pieces to be cut on the same grain line, so pay attention to that when pinning. This is especially important since the wool has a herringbone print to it, which will look wonky if it isn't going in the right direction. I made sure to pin all my pieces in place before cutting anything out, since I was worried about running out of material. As you can see, I'm placing them as close together as I can while still maintaining the proper grain line. Once I was sure they all fit, I cut the pieces out. The front panel of the jacket will be lined with the wool fabric as well, so I'm unpinning the pattern, then cutting it out again, or at least that was the plan. I didn't have quite enough fabric left to cut it as one piece, so I cut them out as 2 and added a bit of seam allowance so I can sew them back together. And with what fabric I had left over, I cut out the collar piece, then used the piece I cut out as a guide for cutting out the collar lining, which is also made from the wool herringbone. Before removing the pins from anything else, I went through and used my scissors to notch each pattern piece at the waistline. It's really important that the waistline matches up perfectly, otherwise it won't fit properly. Then you can unpin everything, and I like to do this by flinging the pins everywhere, then using a magnet to pick them up. It makes this step a little bit more fun. I'm repeating those last few steps with my lining fabric, though I must admit I wasn't paying too much attention to the grain lines here. I did not cut out lining for the front panel or the collar since they will be lined with wool, and I also didn't cut out lining for the sleeves. The interior of them will be finished with bias tape and French seams. But everything else did get cut out once again from the cotton lining. Time for more pinning! The front panel gets pinned to the side front panel, and the back panels are pinned to each other. For the time being, I'm leaving the side and shoulder seams open. When I'm pinning these together, I make sure the waist notches line up, then I pin from that point upward and downward. I never start from the top or bottom of the material, always at the waistline. I'm also pinning together the wool lining for the front panel, so it looks like one piece instead of two. Now it's finally time for sewing. Thicker fabrics can shift as you sew them, especially if you're using a metal foot like I am, so it's important to go slowly. And since the back of this jacket has some curvy seams, I'm really taking my time to make sure there aren't puckers forming as I'm sewing them. You might notice here that I've only pinned 2 pattern pieces together at a time, and that's because I think it makes the ironing and sewing process easier since there's less fabric to manipulate. For the bust seams, I'm clipping the seam allowance so they won't pucker. Then I'm ironing all the seams open from the wrong side of the fabric, and flipping the fabric over to iron the seam on the right side. And if anything's being stubborn, then I'll use a bit of water or steam to get it really smooth. I'm also switching between ironing over a tailor's ham and a sleeve roll. This makes the task much easier and gives a better end result. Once all the seams are ironed, I can pin together the pieces at the side back. I'm still leaving the shoulder seam and the side seam open, since that makes the lapel a lot easier to work on. I'm repeating this process with the lining. The seams get pinned starting from the waist notch and moving outward, then sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And finally, they get ironed. Even though these seams will be on the interior of the jacket, they should still look nice. Now for the fun part, the lapel and collar. The first step in this process is backing each piece with fusible interfacing. To avoid bulk in the seams, the interfacing should be cut a 1/2 inch smaller than the wool layer, and this applies to the interfacing used on the lapels as well. Here you can see me tracing the shape of the lapel onto the interfacing, then marking a line a 1/2 inch away from the tracing so I can avoid having interfacing in the seams. And I cut out 4 identical pieces of interfacing so I can stiffen the wool lining for the lapel as well as the top layer. And then the interfacing gets ironed in place. Now the collar can be pinned onto the front panels at the shoulder of the garment, and this is repeated for the wool lining and the top layers. This part is kind of confusing. I tried the jacket on several times during the process to make sure I had it the right way around. Once pinned, this gets sewn together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and ironed with the seams open. Now the lining layer gets pinned to the top layer with the right sides facing each other. It's very important that the points on the collar and lapel line up perfectly, so I really took my time here. Then I sewed around the edge with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I clipped the seam allowance at the points and notched the curved edges so they will fold over smoothly. Then I turned the pieces the right way out and used a dull colored pencil to get all the points nice and pointy. Once I liked how it looked, I pinned around the edge. And to secure that edge, I'm stitching around it by hand with small running stitches that are 1/10 of an inch away from the edge of the material. It's important that these stitches look nice from both sides of the fabric, since the lining layer is what will be visible when the lapel is turned outward. Here you can see that it looks quite nice from both sides. And here it is on a dress form. After sewing in the lapel lining, it really starts to take shape, but there is still a lot left to do. This jacket requires lots of finishing work, not to mention the addition of big sleeves and buttons. All of that will be tackled in part 2, which should be up within the next 2 weeks. And when it does go up, I will link it in the description box. And as per usual, there's a ton of additional information down below, including links to more detailed blog posts about this project and anything I mentioned in this video. I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll stick around for part 2 and the other videos about making this costume. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.